Pick any wife for free? The judge laughed. I'll take the obese Amish girl. The square of Elk Fork was alive with cruel excitement. Farmers leaned on fence posts, merchants jostled for a view, and the sound of jeering laughter rolled through the chilly autumn air. At the center stood a line of young women, heads bowed, shawls pulled tight, against both the cold and the stares of the men who had come to claim them. Judge Henry Crowell strutted forward, his black coat brushing the dust, his gold watch chain gleaming in the sunlight. He raised his voice so all could hear. Pick any wife for free, he boomed, his grin spreading wide. A little gift to entertain the town. The crowd roared with laughter. Crowell's eyes swept along the line of trembling women until they landed on Miriam, an Amish girl with a soft, round figure and plain dress. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, hands twisting nervously in her apron. Crowell jabbed his cane toward her. I'll take the obese Amish girl, he sneered, his words dripping with mockery. His booming laugh echoed through the square, joined by cruel chuckles from the onlookers. Miriam's cheeks flamed red, her chest tightening as whispers sliced through the crowd. Too fat for a wife, plain as a fence post, who would want her? Shame pressed in from all sides, but beneath it stirred something deeper, a flicker of defiance, a whispered prayer for courage. Before she could collapse under the weight of ridicule, a voice rang out, firm and steady. That's enough. The crowd turned. Daniel, a quiet farmer, known more for his work than his words, stepped forward, his jaw set, his eyes fixed not on the judge, but on Miriam. And in that moment, the laughter faltered. The crowd shuffled uneasily, their smirks fading as Daniel climbed the wooden steps to stand on the platform beside Miriam. He was not a man who sought attention. His life was bound to the soil, to early mornings behind the plow and long evenings in the barn. But today, his broad shoulders seemed taller, his quiet presence heavier than the judge's pomp. Miriam dared to glance at him, her face still burning from humiliation. Daniel had always been kind, helping her carry water at church gatherings, offering her the first slice of bread at community suppers, but she had never believed his small courtesies meant more than pity. Now, standing before the entire town, he looked at her not with embarrassment, but with something fierce and unyielding. Judge Crowell's eyes narrowed. "Farmer," he said with a mocking curl of his lip, "you forget yourself. This is my entertainment, not yours. Step down before you regret it." Daniel's voice, though calm, cut through the murmurs. "No, Judge, I will not step down. Miriam is not yours to ridicule. She is not yours to take." Gasps rippled through the square. No one spoke to Henry Crowell that way. He was a man whose word had sent neighbors to ruin, whose judgments had cost men their land. To challenge him was to court destruction. Miriam's father, Abraham, stepped forward from the crowd. His weathered face betrayed both fear and pride. For years he had watched his daughter mocked for her size, for her plainness, for the quiet way she moved through the world. Now, seeing Daniel stand for her, his chest lifted. Crowell sneered. "And what would you claim her as, boy? A wife? A burden? You'd tie yourself to this lump?" His laughter rolled again, cruel and booming. Miriam flinched, but before shame could crush her, Daniel spoke. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "A wife, a partner, a woman of kindness, of strength. I've known Miriam all my life. She works harder than any man I've met. She gives more of herself than this town deserves. And she deserves better than your mockery." The murmurs grew louder, no longer just jeers. Some nods, some hushed words of agreement. The tide was shifting. Daniel turned, looking directly at Miriam. His voice softened, but carried still across the square. "Let it be me. I'll take you as my wife." Miriam's breath caught. For years she had been the butt of cruel jokes, overlooked, dismissed. And now, in front of the whole town, a man she had quietly admired declared her worthy. Tears welled in her eyes, not from shame this time, but from a strange, overwhelming hope. Her father stepped onto the platform, laying a trembling hand on her shoulder. "If this is your choice, Miriam, you have my blessing. No one will shame you again, not while I draw breath." The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the stage. Judge Crowell's face darkened with rage, but even his power seemed to falter against the quiet strength of Daniel's stand and the courage flickering at last in Miriam's heart. The square of Elk Fork did not disperse quietly. Whispers chased Daniel and Miriam as they stepped down from the platform together, her father walking just behind them with a protective scowl. Some faces still sneered, but others, neighbors who had once turned away from Miriam, now watched her with a strange new regard. For the first time, she felt the weight of their stares shift from ridicule toward something else. Respect, perhaps, or shame for having laughed too long. Daniel did not release her hand until they reached the wagon at the edge of the square. His palm was warm, roughened by years of labor, and Miriam felt strength flow from it like water to parched soil. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to believe this was real. They rode in silence at first. The wagon jolted over ruts. The mule snorted plumes of steam, and the crisp air carried the scent of wood smoke and pine. Miriam kept her shawl pulled tight, staring at the worn boards beneath her shoes. Her mind raced. Judge Crowell's jeering voice still echoed in her ears, but louder still was Daniel's simple, unshakable declaration, "Let it be me. I'll take you as my wife." Finally, she dared to speak. "Why?" Her voice was a whisper nearly lost to the wind. "Why would you shame yourself for me?" Daniel tightened his grip on the reins. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came low, steady, like the earth itself. "Because I've loved you since we were children. Because I've watched you carry burdens no one saw, endure cruelty no one should. And because I will not stand by while men tear you down for sport." Her chest tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She turned her face away, ashamed of the hope blossoming inside her. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not even her own father, until today. As the wagon climbed out of town and into the hills, Daniel reached into a sack behind the bench and handed her a piece of bread. "Eat," he said simply. "You'll need your strength." The gesture, small and plain, nearly undid her. She broke the bread, offering half back to him, but he shook his head with a smile that was both gentle and stubborn. "I'll eat later." The road wound through bare cottonwoods, their branches rattling in the wind like bones. The sun slipped lower, painting the snow-dusted fields with gold. Miriam felt the cold bite less sharply. The silence between them no longer carried the weight of shame. It was a blanket, heavy but warm. By the time they reached Daniel's farmstead, the first stars blinked awake. His house was modest, a log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn leaning slightly but solid, the smell of hay and earth rising even in the frozen air. To Miriam, it looked more like a sanctuary than any church she had known. Daniel hopped down, then turned and offered his hand again. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. As her boots touched the packed earth of his yard, she felt something shift. She was not being dragged or mocked. She was stepping into a place where she had been invited, chosen. Inside, the cabin was warm with firelight. A kettle of stew simmered over the hearth, filling the room with the rich scent of meat and herbs. Daniel set a bowl before her without a word, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. For Miriam, who had grown used to scraps and sneers, it felt like a feast. When she finally looked up, spoon trembling in her hand, Daniel's gaze was steady on her, not pitying, not mocking, simply seeing her fully as she was. And for the first time, Miriam wondered if perhaps she was not a burden at all. The first nights in Daniel's cabin were filled with an uneasy quiet. Miriam sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, feeling like an intruder in a place that smelled of cedar and earth, a place that bore the marks of a man who lived simply, honestly, and alone. Daniel never pressed her with questions. He simply set a quilt on the bed in the loft and said, "It's warmer up there, you'll rest better." His tone carried no demand, no pity, just plain fact. It was the first time Miriam had been offered a space of her own, and she accepted it with a lump in her throat. Days quickly fell into rhythm. At dawn, the rooster crowed, and Daniel rose to tend the animals. Miriam, still heavy with sleep, would wrap herself in her shawl and join him in the yard. The air was sharp, the frost crunching underfoot, but working beside him gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. She gathered eggs from the hens, milked the cow with slow but steady hands, and learned to sweep the barn clean. Her body ached, but it was the ache of usefulness, not shame. Inside, she took to the kitchen. Her first loaves of bread came out dense, the crust too hard. She winced, waiting for judgment. Daniel only tore off a piece, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "Needs less flour next time." The simplicity of his remark, without ridicule, without laughter, made her eyes burn with tears. Small kindnesses unfolded each day. Daniel carved her a stool with legs strong enough to hold her weight, sanding it smooth so it would not splinter beneath her skirts. He showed her how to chop wood without straining her back, then insisted she keep the lighter axe, while he wielded the heavy one. At meals, he always ladled stew into her bowl first, as though it were the most natural thing. Miriam began to hum as she worked. Old hymns from her Amish childhood slipped past her lips, tentative at first, then stronger as the days passed. The cabin, once silent, but for the crackle of the fire, filled with melody. Daniel never said a word, but once, when she glanced up mid-song, she saw his eyes soften, the corner of his mouth lifting almost into a smile. Evenings grew gentler. She mended shirts by the hearth while he sharpened his tools. They spoke little, but their silences began to feel companionable rather than strained. Miriam dared to tell him small things, how her mother had taught her to bake, how the children at church had mocked her sighs, how she had once dreamed of having a garden of her own. Daniel listened without interruption, nodding at times, his gaze steady. One night, after a storm rattled the shutters and sent snow swirling through the cracks, a goat broke loose and stumbled into the cabin, shaking itself dry on the rug. Miriam gasped, then laughed as she wrapped it in a quilt. Daniel, watching from his chair, let out a low chuckle, rusty, unused, but real. The sound warmed her more than the fire. With each passing day, Miriam felt pieces of herself returning. Her body, once mocked, carried water and split kindling. Her hands, once idle, stitched and kneaded and stirred. Her voice, once silenced, filled the cabin with song. She was not a burden here, she was needed. One evening, staring into the flames, she asked softly, "Why did you speak for me that day? You could have stayed silent." Daniel laid his knife aside, his voice low but unwavering. "Because I was tired of watching men tear down what they don't understand. Because I saw your worth long before they mocked you for it." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said such words to her. She turned away, tears burned in her eyes. But in her heart, something fragile and new began to bloom. Hope, tentative, but alive. The cabin, once a refuge for Daniel alone, was slowly becoming something more. It was becoming a home for both of them. Winter deepened in Elk Fork, the snow falling heavy enough to muffle the world. For a time, Miriam felt almost invisible to the cruelty of the town. Daniel's farmstead became her refuge, the rhythms of chores, the warmth of the hearth, the quiet strength of a man who treated her not as a burden, but as a partner. But shadows did not sleep. One morning, Daniel returned from town with a grim set to his jaw. He placed a folded notice on the table. "Crowell hasn't forgotten." Miriam unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. It was a summons signed by Judge Henry Crowell himself, claiming that Daniel had interfered with lawful proceedings and that Miriam was still an unwed dependent without rights to land or property. The words were legal, cold, but Miriam felt the venom behind them. Crowell had not just been humiliated that day in the square, he meant to make them pay for it. Her heart pounded. He wants me dragged back in front of them all to shame me again. Daniel shook his head, his eyes burning. "Not while I breathe." That night, unable to sleep, Miriam searched the loft for extra quilts. Instead, she stumbled upon a wooden chest, half buried under old tools. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in cloth. When she opened them, her breath caught. They were deeds, yellowed but intact, granting her mother's family grazing rights across a wide stretch of valley land, rights signed decades earlier under treaty. She carried them down to the firelight. "Daniel, these are real." He studied them, his brow furrowed. "Your mother's bloodline carried Cherokee rights. Crowell can't erase that. If these papers are upheld, you're no one's dependent. You're a landholder in your own name." Hope sparked, faint but fierce. For years, Miriam had believed herself a burden, tethered to her father's shame. Now, in her hands, lay proof that she was more than what the town whispered. But Crowell moved swiftly. Days later, word reached them. The judge had arranged for deputies to seize Daniel's farm under claim of illegal harboring. Worse, rumors spread through Elk Fork that Miriam had bewitched Daniel, that her size and silence masked something unnatural. Gossip, always cruel, now had venom. Neighbors began to whisper at church gatherings. Some averted their eyes. Others muttered about Daniel's defiance. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Miriam whispered, "Maybe I should go back. If I leave, he'll stop hurting you." Daniel leaned forward, his scarred hands gripping hers. "Don't you dare say that. You think giving yourself up will end his cruelty? No. Men like Crowell don't stop when you bow. They stop when you stand." Her chest ached with fear, but his words planted something stronger: resolve. The next Sunday, they carried the deeds to town, tucked in Miriam's shawl. The streets buzzed with rumor as they walked side by side into the courthouse. Crowell sat high at the bench, his smug smile curling as he looked down at them. But Miriam did not lower her eyes. For the first time, she lifted her chin, her voice steady as she placed the papers before him. "These prove my rights. I am not your entertainment. I am not your shame. I am free." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Crowell's sneer faltered as the weight of the old treaties pressed down upon him. Yet Miriam knew this was only the beginning. Crowell's pride was wounded, and a man like him would not let go so easily. The storm had only begun to gather. The courthouse doors slammed open with a gust of icy wind. Judge Crowell's face burned crimson, his hands gripping the bench as murmurs spread through the room. The papers Miriam had laid before him sat like a stone of truth, too heavy for even his arrogance to ignore. "You think a scrap of old ink gives you power over me?" he thundered. "This is my town, my law." He signaled sharply, and two deputies stepped forward, rifles slung across their shoulders. "Seize her!" Crowell barked. "Seize them both! If the people will not respect order, they will respect the iron of my hand." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Miriam's heart pounded as the deputies advanced, their boots echoing against the wooden floor. She clutched the shawl at her chest. The deeds pressed tight against her. For a breath, fear threatened to crush her. Then Daniel stepped forward. His body became a wall between her and the deputies, his voice ringing out with a steadiness that shook the room. "You'll not touch her, not today, not ever." The deputies hesitated, shifting uneasily beneath the weight of his defiance. The crowd stirred, whispers rising. A farmer in the back called, "She's in the right. We all saw what Crowell did at the auction." Another voice followed, then another, until the murmur swelled into a tide of protest. Judge Crowell's sneer faltered as his authority cracked. He slammed his gavel, shouting for order, but the people no longer cowered. Even Abraham, Miriam's father, stood from his seat, his weathered face hard with shame turned to anger. "You mocked my daughter. You tried to strip her of her dignity. No more." The deputies froze, caught between Crowell's command and the shifting tide of the town. Miriam's hands trembled, but she stepped from behind Daniel, her voice rising clear and strong. "I am not your joke, Judge. I am not a prize for your cruelty. I am a woman of worth, and I will not be broken by you." The room fell silent, her words echoing like the crack of a whip. For a long moment, Crowell glared, his lips twisted. But the deputies lowered their rifles. The people's eyes no longer feared him. His power, built on humiliation and silence, crumbled beneath the weight of their defiance. Crowell shoved back from the bench, his robe sweeping the floor. "This isn't over," he spat, storming from the courthouse. But everyone watching knew it was. Miriam's chest heaved, her eyes glistening. Daniel reached for her hand, steady and warm, grounding her. Together they stood taller than the judge had ever been. That evening, back at Daniel's farmstead, the world seemed quieter. Snow drifted soft against the window panes, and the fire in the hearth painted the cabin walls in a warm glow. Miriam sat at the table, her shawl wrapped close, the bundle of deeds resting beside her like a promise. Daniel set a bowl of stew before her and lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a while they ate in silence, the simple comfort of shared food more powerful than any words. At last Miriam lifted her gaze. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from something new, hope. "Today I thought I would break again, but I didn't. I found a strength I didn't know I had. Daniel's rough hand reached across the table covering hers. You've always had it. The judge only showed the town what I've seen all along. Her throat tightened, tears shimmering in her eyes. She looked around the cabin, the table scarred by use, the fire that never failed, the man whose steadiness had turned her humiliation into dignity. For the first time, she felt not like an outcast, but like someone who belonged. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, warmth and silence wrapped around them like a quilt. Miriam smiled faintly, whispering, "Maybe this is where our life begins." Daniel's eyes held hers, steady as stone. "If you'll have it." Her tears spilled, but this time they were born of joy. She nodded, clutching his hand, and in that small cabin, beneath the endless sky, a new story began, not of shame, but of courage, love, and the quiet defiance of two hearts standing against the world. Stories like Miriam's remind us that even in the harshest places, dignity and love can rise above cruelty. She was mocked, discarded, and humiliated before a crowd, yet she found her voice, her worth, and a man who saw her for who she truly was. Her journey belongs to anyone who has ever been told they are not enough. If you've ever felt small in the world's eyes, may this tale remind you that strength and love often bloom in silence before they shine. Tell me, where are you listening from? And if you still believe in love's power, stay with us.